The case that I would make for the Gospels is that they are highly, highly reliable documents. Just this whole idea that it was made to look like Jesus and all this other stuff, that's just completely ad hoc.
What is your answer to David Hume?
You don't get to just say, well, natural explanation is always better. I'm sorry, but no.
Hello, Eric. Welcome to the Light the World podcast and also just the LT World YouTube channel. Glad to have you. How you doing?
Good, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, excited to have you on. Do you want to just tell my audience a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name, obviously it's Erik Manning, and I run the YouTube channel Testify. That's been going, I've been publishing regular on there since about January of 2021. Just trying to upload something at least once a week consistently. That's when I've been started there, and mostly focused on historical apologetics, the argument for miracles, historical reliability of the Gospels, resurrection of Jesus, and things like that. I do get into some other issues here and there related to Christian apologetics and defending the faith, but those are really where I tend to focus on the most, those areas.
Yeah, it's really cool. And do you also run something like some sort of ministry or something as well?
I am a Reasonable Faith chapter director, but I'm inactive like at the moment.
Okay.
I'm out of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and so just still trying to work on getting something going with that. I'd love to be able to do it and work more in person with people, but it's just a matter of partnering with the right other churches and ministries to do that. And it's funny because as soon as I became a Reasonable Faith chapter director, within a few months, COVID hit, and there was no meeting anywhere for a while. Obviously, all of that's changed and everything's fine now. But I think I kind of took a backseat to the YouTube channel, but I'd like to pick that up and see if I could do both in tandem at some point.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess before we jump into the questions about the New Testament and the Bible, one question I am kind of curious about is why or how did you get into Bible apologetics?
Well, I've always had an interest in history. I was not a good student in high school. I was not a Christian, and I was just really distracted with a lot of bad friends and doing goofy things, partying and different things like that. But it's funny, no matter how poorly I would do at in my other classes, I would always ace history, whether I studied or not. I just always had a knack for remembering historical facts, being interested in history. I could sit and watch documentaries and weird stuff all day, even as a kid. So I think that's just where I naturally gravitated towards, was the historical stuff. It's just easier for me to remember. As far as getting into apologetics in general, probably about 10 years ago or so, I was having a conversation with a couple coworkers, and the conversation shifted to like spiritual things, and I tried to talk a little bit about Christianity and share my faith. And the people that I was sharing my faith with, one of them was a super educated guy, very much into science and different things like that, and just thought that the Bible and science were just incompatible. And then there was another guy that was a coworker just sitting with him, and he was his parents were missionaries, Baptist missionaries. He grew up in the church, but he left the church. He was really interested in like New Age and stuff, but he had a lot of objections to Christianity that I couldn't necessarily answer at that moment. And so at that point, I realized, like, if I'm going to be able to share my faith in this kind of an age where people are growing increasingly skeptical, I'm going to have to learn. And so I started getting interested in Christian apologetics, and but the thing about apologetics is it's very broad, kind of like mentioned already. I focused a lot on history, but at that point I didn't really know where to focus or where to find the information. And I kind of shared some of my concerns in a Facebook group, and lo and behold, Dr. Tim McGrew, who's a university professor teaches philosophy, I believe at Western Michigan, um, offered to kind of like mentor me and a handful of other people who express similar issues. He gave us a huge bibliography, whole long reading list, and
Hmm.
he made himself very accessible for us to ask him questions and different things like that. And so I had a lot of help just finding, I guess, a good mentor right out the
Hmm.
gate, to really point me in the right direction. And I mean, as far as historical apologetics goes, and the man is a walking encyclopedia. Obviously, his wife, too, has written books on the reliability of the Gospels that are just fantastic. And they're both crack epistemologists, like just
Yeah.
really sharp. And so those are good combinations.
Yeah, I know for myself personally, I dabbled a little bit into the history of like the Bible and stuff. I've read some books on it. I've always been more intrigued by the philosophical defense of Christianity rather than
Mm.
the historical. But I have dabbled into the historical a bit, and the scientific is probably the one I dabbled into the least because I find it the least interesting. But that's just me. But yeah, so that's really cool to hear. I really like to hear that. And since it sounds like you have been studying at least the historical side of things for a while now, I think it's a good place to start with the historical case for the New Testament. Because really, if you want to defend Christianity, you need to be able to defend the Bible. It's kind of the base groundwork for most theology and most beliefs within the Christian system. So I
Mm.
suppose we will start there. So my first question would be, what is the like, let's start with the New Testament. What are some of the biggest reasons for why you believe the New Testament is reliable?
The New Testament, we could talk about Acts, we could talk about the Gospels,
Let's start
both of
with the
them.
Gospels specifically, because
Sure.
that's like the crux of it all.
Yeah, sure. Well, there are a lot of good reasons, both internal and external, I think, to trust the Gospels and to um, that they read more as eyewitness testimony versus kind of what we commonly hear. According to skeptics, it's like they're just kind of these far removed stories that are just kind of passed down and passed down and passed down and
Hmm.
corrupted over time. Like the telephone game is like critics like Ehrman and others like to tell us. Yeah, and I don't really think that that's the case at all. I think that there's very strong evidence that they are reliable. There's different lines of evidence that we could talk about. I think there are several. Undesigned coincidences might be a good place for us to start.
Okay.
If people aren't familiar with those, we could definitely talk about those.
Yeah, I mean, I think
But
a crash course would be nice.
yeah, yeah, sure. So undesigned coincidences, I think is uh, one that's really easy for people to get because anybody can crack open their Bible and look at these different things, and they don't have to know tons and tons of history. But basically, the way that undesigned coincidences work is sometimes two works by different authors interlock in a way that would be very unlikely if one of them were copied from the other or both were completely copied from a common source. So, for example, one book might mention in passing a small detail that answers some question raised by another, and the two records fit together like
Hmm.
pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So, like an illustration, maybe like from real life, you could just imagine this. This is just a hypothetical, but um, let's just say two people decided to meet at like a minor league baseball game, and they're going to discuss some sort of like major business situation, and they're friends
Hmm.
of yours, and they both tell you about something that happened at the game, and they're meeting and different things like that. But one of them includes a detail of, say, like they got beer just all spilled all over their jeans, right? And they weren't even themselves drinking. They, maybe they're a good fundamentalist Baptist and they're just having a Sprite. I don't know, but
Yeah.
anyway. But then the other friend says that he was um, reaching for some people around him had a foul ball hit in their direction,
Mm.
and somebody had jumped over him to try and get that particular foul ball, right?
Hmm.
Well, if you put those two stories together, that explains the spill and the beer because people are scuffling over a foul ball. And yeah, that also explains some of the other scuffling and the skirmish there with that. And so it kind of works something like that. And so basically, to give like a few examples that I think that'll probably bring the point out a little bit more. Um, One of my favorite illustrations is found. We could start in the Gospel of John, right? And
Yeah.
so there's the feeding of the 5,000, and you have Jesus, turning to his disciples. And it says that in John 6:5, that Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may have something to eat?" Well, if you're creating a gospel story about the feeding of the 5,000, you might ask yourself, like, well, why Philip? Right. I mean, if you're making up a gospel story, who do you think you probably pick, right? You'd probably pick, I don't know, Peter, because he's always like the most vocal, or
Yeah.
Judas, he has the money bag, or Matthew or something like that, because he would know something about money. But why Philip? He plays like a really minor role. You don't see him in the synoptic gospels at all, and you just see him here, there, and John. Well, if we actually read in an unrelated place in John 1:44 and in John 12-21, we find out that Philip was from Bethsaida.
Hmm.
Okay. So that's kind of an interesting nugget, but it still doesn't really tell us anything. It's only when we turn to Luke 9:10-11, and it reads, "On the return, the apostles told him all that they had done, and they took them and withdrew apart from a town called Bethsaida. And when the crowds learned from it, they followed him." Ah, okay.
Mm.
So here we find out that Philip is actually from Bethsaida. But Luke doesn't mention Philip at all. He doesn't mention that whole conversation between Jesus and Philip whatsoever. And John and Matthew don't mention that Bethsaida was the location of the feeding of the 5,000. And so these little clues just kind of fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I see what you're
Yeah.
saying. Now,
Yeah.
you
Go
said
ahead.
something that's interesting about the common source, because obviously this idea of divine coincidence, or I forget the word you were used specifically,
Undesigned coincidences. Yeah.
undesigned coincidence.
Yep.
It relies on the predicate that these are separate accounts, right? It would rely on the predicate that there isn't a common source that they're sharing to come up with their accounts.
I wouldn't necessarily say that.
Okay.
What a lot of times critics will do is they'll say, well, hey, Eric, you big dummy, don't you know about the synoptic problem?
Yeah,
And,
that's
that
kind of where I
Mark
was
was the
heading.
first gospel. Yeah. And then Matthew and Luke both shared Mark and maybe some other common source like Q. And then John probably was familiar with these other three gospels, even though he doesn't really allude to them and different things like
Yeah.
that. And so couldn't all of this be from a common source? And no, I don't think so. And the reason why is that I think what critics tend to do is they get this very black and white kind of thinking, right? Either the gospels are like completely dependent almost on these different sources, Q and Mark. And then
Hmm.
of course, John is he's just doing his thing out there, according to the critics, you know, or they're totally independent. And that would almost be like the fundamentalist kind of kooky idea of like, well, yeah, there are all these four different gospels and they're telling us four different stories. And it's like, well, no, obviously, we know that they're using somebody as a source, right?
Yeah.
Because the stories are so similar, right?
Yeah.
But the thing about these particular details is they're very subtle, they're very casual, um, and you're not finding them all in one particular source. And so what they show is that there's partial independence, while even though there is some dependence, right? That they
Yeah.
can have dependence. What the critical do, what the skeptical do, is they'll just say, well, anything that's different from Mark must just be redaction, and like Matthew's just doing it for some hyper literary purpose. That's
Yeah.
kind of what's cool about this particular argument, is it shows that no, it's not a literary purpose. These things fit way better together and interlock the way that they do,
Hmm.
because they're not just Matthew just making something up. Because if that was the case, you wouldn't expect so many of these little subtle casual interlockings that way. And the idea that like, well, Matthew's doing this really on purpose, or John is doing this really on purpose, or Luke is doing this really on purpose, doesn't really read that way. Doesn't
Yeah.
really seem like that's the best hypothesis. And they crisscross all throughout each other, and so it just makes it even more unlikely that that's what's
Hmm.
happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying. Now, I guess as someone who I've read a couple books myself, and I'm a storyteller at heart, and so I know like nuance and symbolism and detail is very important to storytelling. So how can we know, or how could someone know that the Bible hasn't been changed over the time by people who've, let's just say the Catholic Church or something, when they had their hands on it, were able to manipulate things to add in those nuances to maybe create a more believable story? How can we have reliance that these are original manuscripts or original tellings?
Sure. I mean, I would just refer somebody that had a question like that to like the likes of Dan Wallace and whatnot, who are really into the textual criticism stuff.
Hmm.
I mean, I think we have an abundance of manuscripts. I understand that most of our manuscripts are late. You know, I don't want to overstate the case. And a lot of the manuscripts that we do have, the early ones are, you know, they're not in the first century or anything else like that.
Hmm.
But I think that we do have enough to where we can go back and kind of trace what the original text says. And even a critic like Bart Ehrman, who will write an entire book on this particular topic, will say things like, well, yeah, but the vast majority of what we do have in the New Testament isn't really in dispute. There's only a few of these things like the long ending of Mark, or the pericope adultery in John chapter 8, which we know were probably inserted. And the
Hmm.
reason why we know is because we can go back and compare all of the different manuscripts. And so it's not a particular area of mine where I specialize with that, just because
Okay.
so many other people have done it
Yeah.
so well. But when you get basically Bart Ehrman and Dan Wallace basically agreeing with each other, and them just having maybe slightly different conclusions on what that particularly leads to, but still agreeing that the text that we have it as is pretty much what we would have in the originals, then
Hmm.
I don't really see a problem. In the conspiracy thinking of like, oh, it's Constantine and in the Nicaea
Yeah.
and all this other
Yeah.
stuff, they're inserting this stuff, doesn't really have any strong basis in history whatsoever.
Hmm. I know I've read More Than a Carpenter. I don't know if you ever read that book, but I read that book and he talks about like the several different manuscripts, like the 40,000 whatever, and he goes on about manuscripts for a while. So I wasn't sure if that was something you delved into too much or not, but I was just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, well, to that point, I would say more than a Carpenter, I would say kind of, I'm not saying it's a bad book. It's
Hmm.
kind of a good introduction. But just be careful, I will say, as a Christian, uh, some people have a tendency to overstate
Hmm.
the manuscripts. And so a lot of the manuscripts that he's talking about are centuries after Jesus.
Hmm.
But I still would say we have enough early manuscripts and enough copying diversity all throughout the empire and whatnot, different languages and stuff, that we could still go back and hammer out the text that we need in order to get where we need to go. So I think he a bit overstates it in there a little bit, and you have to
Hmm.
kind of watch that in some of these popular level treatments.
Yeah.
But yeah, somebody like Wallace will just straight up tell you the facts and
Hmm.
where they are.
Yeah. So yeah, are there any other are there any other arguments as far as the historical accuracy of the New Testament goes that you tend to like to rely on
Sure.
or reference?
Well, yeah. I mean, again, with the undesigned coincidences, I just gave you people one,
Yeah.
and so it's a cumulative argument. And so if people, I'll answer that question in just a second, but I just want to let people know that was just one, and one could be statistical noise. But there are
Yeah.
literally dozens and dozens of them. They're outlined in a book by Lydia McGrew called Hidden in Plain View. And I think she has like 30 in the Gospels and 20 in Acts and Paul's letters. So be sure to check out those, because there's more to that particular case. But there also is a lot of external confirmations that are similar to undesigned coincidences.
Okay.
A lot of times when people are trying to argue for the Gospels, they'll say something like, well, Josephus mentions Jesus and all of this, and he mentions Jesus' brother and all this other stuff.
Hmm.
And I think that's interesting to a certain extent, because it tells us at least what early Christians believed. But I think a more powerful line of evidence is that we can look at the Gospels and Acts for incidental allusions that reveal the author's knowledge of the setting and their truthfulness in recounting matters of detail.
Okay.
And by examining how the Gospels and Acts deal with difficult details of contemporary history, we could actually test their knowledge and their honesty. And
Hmm.
so it's like these little details that they get right in history that I find to be like really interesting. Like, for example, there's one where this is in John's Gospel in chapter 2, verse 18 through 20. It says that the Jews responded to him. This is after he cleansed the temple. And
Hmm.
they ask him, what sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this? And Jesus answered them and said, destroy this temple, um, and I will raise it again in 3 days. And they replied, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple. Are you going to raise it in 3 days?" And so Josephus tells us that Herod began work on the temple during the 18th year
Okay.
of his reign. So that's 19 BC. So obviously there's no year zero, right? So
Hmm.
if we count down, 46 years from 19 BC is 28 AD.
Hmm.
And so that helps us answer when Jesus began his public ministry. If we actually look at Luke chapter 3 and verse 1, it corroborates this. And it says that that Jesus began his ministry after being baptized by John the Baptist. It was the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. And we know from Suetonius that Tiberius became a co-emperor with Augustus in the autumn of 12 AD.
Hmm.
So the 15th year equals 27 AD. And so that's the time of the temple cleansing in John chapter 2, following the Passover, which works out to the spring of 28 AD. And so by two independent methods, from using information from John, Luke, Josephus, and say Suetonius,
Hmm.
who's a Roman historian. Josephus was a Jewish historian. We can actually confirm the date on which Jesus cleansed the temple.
Okay.
And it's kind of like, how does that happen just by, accident? How does that all correspond like that? And what's kind of interesting about that too is it kind of ties into another undesigned coincidence within the Gospels, because we read in Mark chapter 14:58, when Jesus is on trial, and he's kind of before the Sanhedrin, these witnesses come in and they say, I will just, we heard him say, "I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands."
Hmm.
And but it's like, what? Like, where is it? Where does that even come from, right? We never hear in any of the synoptic gospels of Jesus saying anything about that. And so John gives us the original statement of Jesus, but when Jesus is on trial before Pilate, or in John chapter 19, we never
Yeah.
hear anything about the charge of the temple, right? So he gives us the original statement of Jesus, but not the its use as an accusation. Well,
Hmm.
Mark gives us the accusation, but not the original statement, and
Yeah.
they all fit together. So um now you just got all kinds of different things intersecting here. And again, this looks a lot more like testimony,
Hmm.
I would say, on the hypothesis that these are just highly literary, creative works of fiction with some truth layered in with a lot of embellishment. Does that make
So
sense?
yeah. So here's an interesting question, I suppose, is yes, what if people would consent to the fact, or a skeptic would consent to the fact, that there are undesigned coincidences within the Gospels or within the New Testament broad writ, but what about, let's just say, there about potential Bible contradictions? So, for instance, I've heard many skeptics say that there are multiple different testimonies or variations of the resurrection story, with how many people went to visit the tomb versus how many people and like just different things like that. How do you normally approach someone who says actually the Bible has so many contradictions that even the things that it gets right are outweighed by the things it gets wrong?
Oh boy. Yeah. No, I would say, man, this is a cumulative case here that I'm making. And I could think
Yeah.
of, like, literally, if you combine all the undesigned coincidences, and then you look at all of the between the gospels, and then you look at all the we'll just call them undesigned coincidences between the gospels and other historical sources and incidental little details little
Hmm.
details um that looks way more like eyewitness testimony, when you got literally probably like over 100 that I could probably detail. If we had a long time, we could do it. If people want to go to my colleague Jonathan McClatchy's YouTube channel, Talk About Doubts, where he does like weekly teaching sessions with people who have questions about Christianity and some doubts and different things like that.
Hmm.
He's going through a whole study of all of these, and like it's 8 hours worth of stuff, and he's only begun to scratch the surface. And so when you take that into consideration with contradictions, well,
Hmm.
when Bart Ehrman says that the New Testament is just like a world of contradictions, I have a friend who has a very heavily annotated version of the particular book that he says that Jesus interrupted. And when you look at all of the different kind of contradictions that he's coming up with, a lot of them are completely manufactured contradictions. They're very artificial.
Hmm.
They rely a lot of times on like arguments from silence, silly readings, tendacious readings. just uncharitable readings and all kinds of other things. I think that he probably raises probably a little over half a dozen actual contradictions that you could say, like, okay, these look like they could be some contradictions, and those have received some scholarly treatment. But a handful of contradictions doesn't outweigh all of that, because with eyewitness testimony, what do you expect? You do expect variation, right?
So
and a lot of times these variations can even be quite easily reconciled. And when that happens over and over again, it's kind of like, oh, well, like this boogeyman that you're trying to paint of contradictions just really isn't as scary as you're making it out to be. Does that make sense, kind of?
Yeah, that's similar to answers I've heard from other books I've read and stuff from different scholars and things like that. The interesting thing that always gets brought up, though, is the topic of inerrancy when you start going down that route, because some people are going to die on that hill that the Bible needs to be inerrant, while other people say, well, it doesn't need to be inerrant, it just needs to be generally true. So I know sometimes people get nervous when something's found in the Bible that may not be, may seem like a contradiction, or may seem like it doesn't completely line up, and then they get afraid that the Bible's not inerrant, everything must be wrong. I don't know how you view that sort of topic.
Well, I would say that in order to be a Christian, it doesn't require one to believe in inerrancy. But the case that I would make for the Gospels is that they are highly, highly reliable documents. So I wouldn't put it in the category of generally reliable, because that's kind of a weird. People define that differently, I think. But I would say that they're very highly successful reporters. And so if that's the case, then the central facts of Christianity would be true, because Jesus would be risen from the dead. Because if these statements that they're making goes back to the original eyewitnesses, which is what this argument would entail, then we have to ask, why would they make such a claim about such detailed testimony of Jesus being raised from the dead in the face of opposition?
And then
so
that kind of goes down the liar, lunatic, and I forget what the other one is, liar, lunatic, or Lord sort of argument. Kind of starts going down that way.
Yeah, it would. You're just, instead of it's being Jesus, you're saying it would be the disciples. They were either deceived, or they were deceivers, or they were telling the truth. And so, I don't think that one has to die on the hill of inerrancy. I myself am an inerrantist in the sense that I'm willing to be mistaken about that particular belief. But I don't think that it's, if somebody can show me a contradiction, it wouldn't sink my faith. It would just cause me to rethink the doctrine of inspiration a little bit. And so I know, like, Lydia McGrew herself, she's not an inerrantist. But I think her husband Tim might sort of loosely be one, but I could be mistaken about that. So I don't want to say for sure. But anyway, so I don't think that it's more of a secondary issue, but it can be. People push it into the middle, and I think when you do that, you're kind of setting people up for failure if, say, there was something that we couldn't resolve. But and the other thing too is you have to think about any good scientific theory. You're always going to have some sort of anomalous data. So you can have a lot of data pointing in one particular direction. And you could have one thing that's just like, I don't know how to resolve this, but I got all this other data going this way. So that one little piece of data doesn't crash the whole theory. So, does that make sense?
Yeah, I see what you're saying there. So it sounds like we could obviously delve into this even deeper and further, but it sounds like obviously there is a lot of evidence, or at least reason to believe, that the New Testament and the Gospel specifically are reliable. And we could go down a bunch of different routes. I know a few arguments I've heard before is the idea of, like, for instance, there's women testimony, which, why would you use women testimony if you're creating a lie? Certain things like that. A lot of internal evidence for the robust historicity of the Gospels specifically. And then going to Acts, there's also different stories within Acts that people will say, well, these wouldn't be in here if they're trying to create a lie or something like that. But on the basis of the New Testament being reliable, obviously goes into the theology of Christianity and as far as the life of Jesus. And so I think an interesting topic now, since it's been, I think, about half an hour or so, I would like to spend the next half talking more about, I guess, the life of Jesus as dictated by the New Testament. So after you establish that the New Testament is reliable, what does it actually say about Jesus? And so that's kind of like my first question here. If the New Testament is reliable, we're going to assume it is for this portion of the portion of the interview. What does it actually say about Jesus' deity, his death, and resurrection?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, especially with his deity. I mean, and this is why I think a robust defense of John is so important, because there are a lot of different ways that Jesus like talks about his deity. I think in the Gospel of Mark and
Mhm.
Matthew and Luke, but obviously the overt claims are going to be found in something like John 8:58, where he says, "Before Abraham was, that I am." Now, a lot of
Yeah,
times scholars will argue against that, like, well, that's not in the other gospels. Well, that's just an argument from silence, dude.
yeah,
And so like so I don't think that dog particularly hunts, but basically the point of all of this, when you look at the different arguments for the reliability of the gospels, is that if these authors are that reliable, then they didn't make things up. They were
hmm,
very careful about what they wanted to include, and it looks like what they recorded was originally claimed by the eyewitnesses, and this would include the resurrection appearances, right? Now, what the skeptic is going to want to say is that, like, maybe they saw something, but it was brief, it was vague, it was distant, and then all these different details were later added on and embellished, right?
yeah,
But this particular argument that I'm pushing pushes completely against that, right? And so if the skeptic is willing to say, well, maybe they were saying all of these different things that were right, but they were just making things up when it comes to the resurrection or different miracles, I would just say that no. I mean, this view that I'm giving you is a unified view. It explains the evidence better than a disunified view, where the authors were getting all of these things right, showing signs of truthful testimony, but suddenly at other times considering themselves free to just completely make things up. They're not
yeah,
schizophrenic.
yeah,
And so if that's the case, then it goes back to what the original eyewitnesses said.
hmm,
And as I kind of alluded to earlier, they made, if you think about what was in the Gospels, um, the the content of what they claimed was that Jesus rose physically from the dead, and it's a lot more detailed than what we get in 1 Corinthians 15, where a lot of apologists will try and focus on what we get in 1 Corinthians 15, which is good, but it tells us that the belief in the resurrection was early, and that the belief in the resurrection was something that was being preached right away. But
hmm,
it doesn't necessarily tell us what the details were like. Well, the
hmm,
Gospels talk about them eating with Jesus, uh, talking with Jesus, conversing with Jesus, touching Jesus, um, spending time with him for over a period of 40 days before he ascended into heaven. These are things that are very, very difficult to be mistaken about, right? This isn't
yeah.
a brief visionary
So,
experience or a
so,
religious experience that just was here for a minute and is gone.
so I guess obviously something that's been raised up to, I guess, defend a skeptical view about the whole resurrection thing, seeing Jesus and all that, is the hallucination theory. Was popular for a little bit. I don't know. You can explain what the hallucination theory is probably better than I could to my audience. But if you would like to tackle that argument.
Well, sure. And this is why I think that my particular way that I would defend the resurrection would differ and push back more strongly against, say, like a minimal facts argument, if people are familiar with that at all. The minimal facts argument will just kind of rely on the testimony of Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, which all scholars agree, like, they're not going to dispute that like they would dispute the Gospels. But I'm willing to say, let's dispute the Gospels. Let's have that argument, right? Game on. Let's fight that one out. Where the minimalist will just say, no, we're content with whatever the scholars will concede, which is that you know there's a creed in 1 Corinthians 15 which describes the appearances to the 12 and to Paul and to James and 500 people and all of that kind of stuff. But that doesn't 1 Corinthians 15 doesn't give us any details of what the appearances were
Hmm.
like. And as I said, the Gospels give us those details. And if they go back to
Yeah.
what the original eyewitnesses claimed, then they made that particular claim in the context of a hostile audience, founding a new religious group, making this claim in public in Jerusalem, of all
Yeah.
places, where Jesus was very recently crucified, and that we know that they were willing to endure labors and dangers and sufferings. And so I think my particular view with the hallucination hypothesis is like, no, these aren't things that you could be mistaken about. Hallucinations don't pass broiled fish and invite you to touch their wounds. Okay. And so I'm willing to say that. I'm willing to go above just, well, group appearances don't happen in hallucinations. Well,
Yeah.
group religious mass hysteria definitely happens. We know that's a phenomenon that happens. And I think
Hmm.
somebody who's just using 1 Corinthians 15 is going to have a very difficult time getting past that. But what I'm saying is that the details of their testimony are of such that it would be almost impossible for them to be mistaken. Does that
Yeah.
make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah. Yeah. It would be much harder for that to be, fabricated or part of a hallucination or something like that.
Yeah, it would be a lot just mistaken. That would tackle the mistaken option. So all of your
Yeah.
mistaken options there, mass religious ecstasy, hallucinations, social contagion, all of that other kind of stuff. Um, that's dead if the case that I'm making about the gospels goes through.
Yeah.
And so yeah.
I mean, obviously, the resurrection is typically the one that secular atheists will go after, particularly. But what's interesting is that obviously one of the second largest religion in the world, Islam, claims that Jesus never died. In the Quran, it claims that it appeared that he died, but he actually did not die. What is typically your approach to someone who would ask you to defend the death of Jesus, or at least claim that Jesus never died?
Well, I mean, it would just be this similar case that I'd be making right now, is that the gospel authors are habitually truthful, close up to the facts, and scrupulous. Um, and so I think when they report that Jesus was crucified and they gave details of his crucifixion and a spear being pierced in his side, and we have his words and what he said on the cross, and different things like that, and that I think the Romans got their guy.
Yeah.
And
I
so
mean, isn't
uh,
it theoretically though? I guess the argument would go then down to a inescapable sort of straw man, not straw man, like inescapable sort of tie, because the person could always say, "Well, God can do whatever He wants, and He can do anything." Because Allah specifically, I think, in the Quran, deceived the people. So, like in theory, you could the person could always fall back on the idea, well, God can do anything. So therefore, the disciples were deceived and had this whole fabrication because this is what they thought they saw, but that wasn't actually what was happening. It was all
well,
mirage.
I don't think they want to say the disciples thought that. I think they want to say that the disciples, if I remember correctly, they some allude to the fact that they were like the mighty ones who prevailed or something goofy like
Maybe.
that. I'd have to go back and look at their particular surahs. I'm drawn a
Yeah,
bit of a
I've read the
blank.
Quran like once and then pieced through it a couple other times, but
Yeah.
yeah,
So if I remember correctly, that's what they want to say. They particularly like to hone in on Paul, and Paul is this big
yeah,
bad guy dude who messed it all up, which we could talk about that. But I would just say that also brings up a lot of philosophical problems, like why is your God literally deceiving people, and then also somehow they come to the mistaken belief that Jesus rose from the dead, and now this prophet Jesus, peace be upon him, who you say is pretty much the greatest prophet that there ever was, next to Muhammad, pretty much is a huge failure. He didn't basically win a real single convert, hardly.
hmm,
Everybody thought that he was dead, and it took however many years, how many centuries for Muhammad to straighten it out. And basically, this false religion was started because of some bumbling of Allah. Like that's pretty stupid. Also, just this whole idea that it was made to look like Jesus and all this other stuff, that's just completely ad hoc. I mean, you could just literally say that about anybody.
hmm,
When the feeding of the 5,000 happened, well, we could just say that like it was actually Moses raised from the dead, and Allah just made it to look like it was
hmm,
actually Jesus, but it really wasn't Jesus. I mean, like we could play this, face off game all we want. It's kind of
yeah.
becomes absurd after a
And then
while.
it kind of then leads into an argument that we're not going to cover on this interview, but the whole argument of, well, if the Quran is divinely inspired and that can be proven, then we can trust the claim of and what it says about the death of Jesus. But we're not going to go down that route because that would be a whole nother topic. But I think it
Yeah.
would be interesting to talk about Paul, as you already mentioned a little bit about him. There is often debate, I know, among Muslims, and I know also among even secular audiences, that Paul isn't a trustworthy source, or he corrupted the gospels or corrupted the life of Jesus, things like that. And if you go down different routes, I've also heard people who claim the Gnostics are more trustworthy than Paul's letters. So, I mean, I'm just kind of curious about your thoughts on Paul and why you would defend his letters as being canon.
Well, sure. Because Paul, first of all, received the right hand of fellowship from Peter, James, and John. We know that in Galatians chapter 2, verse 9, and the first two chapters of Galatians, basically. He was aware of the other apostles. The other churches were aware of the other apostles as well. He's there clearly doesn't seem to be contradicting them, because the Corinthians could have said, "Hey, we know about Cephas, we know about Peter. He could talk about that." But they're not saying, "Hey, Paul, you're out and out contradicting Peter." I mean, we don't see that. It seems to me all the evidence that we have is that he was preaching the same gospel, that they accepted the gospel that he was saying. And so I would also just say, from part of the strength of my view is I'm going to rely on the details that are in Acts, by making an argument for the reliability of Acts. And when we have that, we don't have just this vague, like in Paul's letters, we don't have details of Jesus' appearance to him.
Yeah.
But in Acts, we do. And we find out that he was blinded for several days. He was miraculously healed. He heard a voice. Other people heard it, but they didn't understand the voice. And then we also have details of Paul's different miracles, which Paul himself alludes to in like Romans 15:9, 19, 2 Corinthians 12:12, and there's other different places. And we also have Paul meeting with different apostles, not just hearing about it in his letters, but we also see about Paul meeting with other apostles in the book of Acts. And so they seem to accept him. Luke is writing a history about the early church, and he spends a ton of time talking about Peter in the early 12 until he starts becoming a traveling companion of the apostle Paul, which is something that is amply evidenced. And so, like, if Paul is preaching a different gospel, Luke sure doesn't seem to know about it, and he's basically writing an endorsement that these guys are saying the same things. Now, the critic is going to say, well, Acts is junk, and it's written in some, I've heard on Myth Vision, some lady was saying it was written in 130 or something crazy by someone who never traveled with Paul. Well, I would say, great, I have dozens of facts that, and I have a playlist on my channel, people want to check it out, that argue to the contrary, that Paul was a traveling companion with them, and so they're preaching the same gospel.
Okay. Yeah. Even though I think also the reason why sometimes that argument gets brought up is because I think Luke's name is never really technically brought up in any of the Acts or in Luke itself. You could
Luke's
correct me
name
if I'm
might
wrong.
not be particularly mentioned, but Luke's name is mentioned throughout all the early documents that we have as far as who actually wrote it. We obviously know whoever wrote the Acts is a traveling companion of Paul for various details that I could outline. So whether it was Luke or somebody else, doesn't matter. It was a traveling companion of Paul. But all the early evidence that we have from church history, starting with the Muratorian canon in 180, that says that it was Luke, and I don't see any good argument to think that it's not Luke. If people want to go to my friend Than's channel, Exploring Reality, me and Dr. Josh Boyce did a 2-hour stream, and the first hour was about Luke's authorship with Dr. Boyce, and he goes into a lot of different details on why we know that Luke wrote that particular gospel. And so just look up Reliability of Acts, Exploring Reality, Erik Manning or something, it'll come up.
And one final thing I would like to ask before we jump into the whole David Hume thing, which I'm thinking you already know what I'm going to go with that. But sometimes there's also, I know from different skeptics that there's often this claim of, well, at the Nicene Creed, where like I think what 300 something AD, I forget what
325,
325 AD at the Nicene Creed, where they started developing the Bible's canon and like what actually is scripture, what's not scripture, all that good stuff. That how can we have I know at least from Muslims I spoke to, there's this distrust in the actual preservance of and the integrity of the scriptures up to that point. And then at that point, we don't know what was actually true or not as far as the scriptures go. Is there any sort of defense in that regard of like the Nicene Creed
Like
being
what's
trustworthy?
canon and what's not canon?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you just read the early church fathers. Who are they quoting? They're quoting Paul's letters. They're quoting the Gospels.
Hmm.
You have Tatian, who was a student of Justin Martyr, writing in 170, and Justin Martyr was writing in 150. Justin calls the Gospels the memoirs of the apostles. He doesn't name the authors by name,
Okay.
but he quotes all four of them. Tatian writes a thing called the Harmony of the Four Gospels, um, and he writes a thing called, excuse me, it's called the Diatessaron, which is a harmony of the four Gospels.
Hmm.
And guess what? They're all full of they're full of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Diatessaron literally means through four. So let's piece that one together for just a second, okay?
Hmm.
So you have Ignatius quoting the Gospels and Paul's letters, and First Peter and First John. You have Polycarp, who was writing in the early. Ignatius was early first century, by the way. You have
Hmm.
Polycarp, which was also early first century, quoting those same writers over and over again. You have Justin Martyr quoting those same writers over and over again.
Hmm.
You have Irenaeus talking about the four different gospels. Um, if you look at church history, the only letters that were actually like questioned were like Second and Third John, Second Peter. There was like some little dispute here and there about Revelation, but not really.
Okay.
And that's like I'm that's about the extent of it. I think maybe Hebrews too, because it was anonymous. There was no question about which books belonged or which not. At least out of the 21 that I
Yeah.
mentioned, there was basically six that were a little bit questionable. And then
Yeah.
there was arguments like, well, do we include something like the Apocalypse of Peter? Or do we include the Shepherd of Hermas or the Letter of
Hmm.
Clement? And most of them would just say, well, these are good books, just like we would read good Christian books today,
Yeah.
but they're late. They're not
Yeah.
apostolic, right?
Or
They don't go
yeah.
back to the original apostles. They don't go back to the original witnesses or companions of the witnesses. That was one of
Hmm.
their key criteria was is this go back to an apostle or a companion of the apostles?
And as
And
far as the Old Testament, wasn't it also what the New Testament quoted from the Old Testament was a big one, as far as what they put as the canon for the Old Testament?
I mean, at that particular point, the Old Testament was settled. Now, I don't know about Old Testament canonicity, to be perfectly honest with you.
Okay.
I don't want to answer that with any firm conclusions. I'm much more of a New Testament guy. uh was there this council of Jamnia that decided that there was some sort of canon at that point? How do they look at it? I don't know. It obviously seems pretty clear that they were valuing the books that we have in our Old Testament, and
Hmm.
obviously we see them quoted in the early church fathers, in the Gospels, in the New Testament. And obviously the Jews seem to value these writings because they preserved them. They kept them. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls with all of these books for a reason.
Yeah.
They obviously valued them very highly, and so and seem to regard them as scripture and regard them as scripture today. So yeah, I don't know Old Testament canonicity as much as maybe New Testament.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I
Hmm.
don't think it's a really up for debate at
Hmm.
this point. You know, obviously Catholics and Orthodox and Protestants have some disagreements there, but that wasn't fully canonized, those particular books, until the Council of Trent. Um, Even though they were probably recognized and read, they weren't formally canonized until that whole,
Yeah.
the Reformation and stuff like that.
Hmm. But Eric, this could all be null and void if philosophically it contradicts itself. I mean, David Hume, let's go into that argument.
Yeah,
David Hume would claim that you shouldn't believe miracle claims. I know, and I've read his book. I read a little bit of David Hume's books and his argument about this whole thing. And generally, it boils down to you just can't trust miracle claims.
sure.
What is your answer to David Hume?
Well, yeah, well, Hume is going to say basically it's always more likely because we know the laws of nature like are constantly confirmed, right? You know, you wake
Yeah.
up in the morning and you drop something or whatever. Nature's laws are just constantly confirmed, and so we have all this evidence for the laws of nature, right?
Hmm.
And so we also know that people are very often mistaken about miracle claims,
Hmm.
or they could often be lying. People often lie and exaggerate and embellish the facts. And so, Hume is just saying what's more likely: all the laws of nature, and then all of a sudden they're violated, or a miracle actually happened. And I think that's where we have to actually look at the testimony. And if the testimony is of such that it is more, the explanation that it wasn't a miracle is far worse than the explanation that it was, or did I get that right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If the miracle explanation fits all the data, but you're really having to do a lot of mental gymnastics to say that it wasn't a miracle. You're going to have to come up with a lot of other weird explanations to cover all of the particular data. Well, that's evidence for a miracle, right? You don't get to do this like mathematical gymnastics and just say, okay, it doesn't, miracles don't happen. You can't trust miracles because this is always more likely. Well, no, it depends on the actual testimony.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It depends on what the actual testimony is. And can it be better explained naturalistically? And you don't get to just say, well, a natural explanation is always better. Okay, well, like, I'm sorry, but no, like Jesus faking his own death, crawling out of the tomb, barely alive and appearing as disciples and convincing them. I've had skeptics say this to me. Well, that would even be more convincing than a miracle. Why? Explain that to me, other than
Yeah.
your particular prejudice and your
I
particular
think
bias.
I think also sometimes I guess tacked onto this is someone like Richard Dawkins who says, well, anytime you use a miracle, you're just arguing from a point of ignorance. So we may not have a scientific reason for why something happened. Doesn't mean there isn't one. Therefore, you're arguing from a point of ignorance and thus can't trust miracles.
Well, that's stupid because everything that we know about science is confirmed over and over and over again. The more we learn about science, the more we know that dead people stay dead. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just idiotic. And so the more we do know about science, the more we know that doesn't happen. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, we have to actually look at the data and what hypothesis better explains the particular data. And as long as there is a non-zero probability that there is a God and that there is some kind of an afterlife, and he wants to make us aware of that particular afterlife, then how is God going to communicate something to us like that outside of a miracle? To
Mm-hmm.
tell me, besides him writing something in the stars, which by the way, that would still be a miracle. Okay, so yeah, he, in order for a revelation to be communicated, a miracle has to happen, right? You don't
Mm-hmm.
get to use the laws of nature as evidence against a miracle, because a miracle would never even be recognized if there wasn't a standard way that natural laws operate, where dead people normally stay dead, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the point. And so anyway, yeah, I think it's a terrible argument. I don't know why people continue to like champion it. And yeah, what Dawkins says, or people say like that, there could be this unknown law. No, there's not going to be an unknown law where all of a sudden one particular person's body is animated and comes back to life,
Mm-hmm.
and and all of this other stuff with no trace of the wounds, except for like on the hands and the side, I guess. But
Yeah.
like where they're acting perfectly fine and eating broiled fish and all that other stuff. No, like that contradicts everything we know about science. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good answer. I think this we're about wrapping up our time here. It's almost at an hour. So thank you, Eric, for coming on. But before you head out, I would like to ask you one more question. Is obviously,
Sure.
do you believe in God? That's a rather clear from what we've been discussing about. What would you say is the biggest reason for why you believe in God?
Just God in general.
Yeah, just God in
Well,
general.
yeah, so I used to be an atheist when I was a teenager. I became an atheist mostly because of the problem of evil.
Mm-hmm.
Like my mom got cancer. I grew up kind of a broken home, and I won't give you all the different testimony.
Yeah.
But I saw a bunch of misery in myself and misery in the world around me. Um, I lived in St. Louis at the time. We had like a terrible like record flood, and I just kind of thought, well, God doesn't exist. So I spent 2 years being an atheist. But as I was thinking about things, I just kind of thought, you know, I don't think that this universe just came to be uncaused and for no particular reason. And with all this appearance of beauty and order and everything else like that. And
Mm-hmm.
even though I don't understand exactly why all of these different evil things happen in the world, I would probably expect to not fully understand all of the reasons for evil, considering that I would be finite compared to God. Now, I don't want to play skeptical theism too hard,
Mhm.
Now, I didn't know anything about philosophy. Okay, I didn't know anything about apologetics. I didn't know anything about the Kalam cosmological argument, or
Yeah.
God, or, Leibniz, or contingency, or design, or any of that kind of stuff. Fine tuning. I didn't even know what fine tuning would have been at that point.
Mhm.
But I just reasoned that this there's probably a reason and a purpose for all of this. So I at least became open to that. And I thought, if God does exist, he probably has revealed himself somehow. And that's why I began to crack open a Bible. I was given a
Mhm.
Bible as a kid, because I went to Catholic school and I had my first communion, even though I didn't understand anything of what was going on. But I was given a Bible and I started to read it, and I liked Jesus. I thought the things that he taught were powerful. And I
Mhm.
thought, this person, if this is these things are accurate, like the things that he teaches and the kind of person that he is amazing.
Mhm.
And the more I had big time problems with miracles, because I didn't experience miracles myself, but I thought these gospels sure read like testimony.
Mhm.
And it's kind of hard to just say that this is just a bunch of like myths or folklore, or they're just making these stories up to teach lessons or something like that. And so I really wrestled with that, and then eventually I just had like a religious experience on top of that,
Mhm.
where I just had an oversensing conviction of the Holy Spirit that I needed to repent and all that other stuff. So is there one particular reason, like best reason? I don't know. I could tell you my particular reason was just a variety of just reasons that kind of lead into apologetics, but it was a lot of tacit, inexplicable reasons. And it kind of ties back to where I was with those coworkers when I couldn't really share my faith with them. I
Mhm.
knew all these things, but I couldn't talk about them
Yeah, you couldn't
in
articulate
a
it.
way that was articulate. Yeah. And
Mhm.
so I think that's what kind of apologetics is. It's like, I think the grandma on the pew who reads the gospels and sees, hey, this is testimony, obviously. And she reads Psalm 19 and says, the heavens declare the glory of God. And she's like, that's right. When I go out and look at the stars and I see all the order and the beauty, and that this didn't come from nowhere, um, I think she understands that. And then we nerd out and we try and find ways to explain these things in nitty gritty details,
Yeah.
and deal with people who make these issues way more difficult than they need to be. So that
Mhm.
was a long-winded answer. Maybe it wasn't a direct answer, but I hope that kind of,
No,
gives you kind of
that
an
works
idea where
great.
I'm
That
coming
works
from.
great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on, Eric. Before you head out, you can let people know where can the people find you again, just as a reminder.
Yeah. So Testify Apologetics, if you just search it in YouTube, it'll come up. The channel's just named Testify. But that's just kind of short. So, or just Testify Eric Manning. You can look me up that way and find more details about what I do on YouTube. You could also go to jesusalive.com if you're not as much of a YouTube person. If you probably watch this, you're somewhat of a YouTube person. But if you want to read some of my articles, I have over 100 articles, mostly on the
Mhm.
reliability of the Gospels there, in more details. And yeah, there's playlists there on Hume's argument, reliability of the Gospels, all of that different stuff there. And then I aim to, on my channel, point people to other resources where they could dive deeper as well.
All right. Thank you, Eric. And I hope the channel keeps growing, and I hope you keep doing well.
Yeah, thanks, man. Thanks again for having me on.